When Margaret and I first bought this house, actually what I should say is when Margaret and I first walked up the hill with Barbara and Clay to what we thought was simply take a tour of their homestead, we were blown away by its just kind of look and design and feel. And obviously, as we toured through the house and toured the property, we noted that it had its issues, and Barbara and Clay were definitely very, very, very forthcoming about those issues. One of which that was rather obvious on the outside was the siding. And the siding of the house, much like most of the house, is actually made from oak. Now, from a simple standpoint, oak is, an incredibly hard and durable wood, but when it's exposed to the sun and the weather, because it's a hardwood, it can have a tendency to warp and twist and curl, and that is exactly what has happened. Furthermore, it's also important to note that this house was built in the early 80s, and it is now, as of today, 2020. So the house and the siding and the roof, for the most part, are nearly 40 years old. And any house would have to have its siding replaced probably in that amount of time. So that's one of the projects we're working on. So I thought I would go around and give you guys a little tour of the siding, what kind of siding it is, and then some ideas on the new siding that we're going to be putting on. This is an example of some of the wood that has been peeling away, the siding I should say. And I'm going to just pan up here. As you can see, this is looking straight up on the north and east side of the building, and you can just see how a lot of this wood has been curling and peeling away. Straight up there you see the one piece that's peeled away at the top. Well, when water comes down, it's going to get right inside there and just basically flood. This style of siding is known as board on board, and board on board basically has two different boards, and they're stacked on top of each other, and there is a gap in between the boards, and that gap is basically just there for the look. You could use this inner board, you could make wider, much wider, and that way you can avoid the gap, but in this case they used the same width board for the whole house, which is a very typical way of doing it, and then it's simply nailed together in various spots to hold it. This shed, obviously to store materials that they had up here, but it too is built with board-on-board siding. Now this obviously has a different framing structure. There's no drywall or anything on the inside, but I did think that it would be a good way to show how you have your board-on-board siding here. And if you look on the inside, so this is exactly the way it would look on the inside of the wall of the main house. Now, ignoring the cross pieces to support this door, you can see that there's this gap here. And the gap here is where our problem lies, because what can happen is insects and bats can get in here and build nests. This is the north wall of the house, and it obviously is not exposed to really any direct sunlight. Now, of course, there is water that comes down off the roof and splashes, but the north wall, the wood has not warped or curled. There are some cracks in the wood itself, but for the most part it's actually in good shape until you look down at the very bottom, where it has been exposed to a lot of water, and the water has run off and caused some rotting at the very bottom of these boards. Now this lower board that you see, I'm pretty sure is a pressure treated lumber, so it's actually held up quite well, but anywhere where the water has basically hung out and stayed, you can see there's a decent amount of rotting that has happened in the wood itself. This is the east wall, and the east wall is probably one of our most favorite sides of the house, simply because it's got this really unique shape to it. So on the right hand side we have a relatively steep, long pitched roof, and on the left hand side we have two different roof lines. The lower one goes over the solarium, and the one above that is going to be our bedroom. You'll also see, obviously we have some scaffolding in the way, but we have 3 large picture windows here. The top floor is the original bedroom that the original owners used. And we actually rent that out as our Airbnb. Another thing that we're going to have to work on is finishing all the trim on the windows. And I'm going to go with a more traditional look for board and batten siding. So all these windows as well are going to ultimately need to get replaced. But I'm going to trim them up all nice and neat once we get to that point. So it has a very traditional board and batten look to it. So one of the things that you can't ever do, especially with siding, is you cannot prevent water from getting behind your siding. It's nearly impossible. Now, some people may debate that and argue it, but the fact of the matter is that all siding, somehow water will get behind it. So the way to solve your problem, not worrying as much about how do I prevent the water from getting behind, but making sure that your inner wall and the siding itself can dry. And allowing it to dry allows it to last longer. One of the things that you may see in very old homes from the early 1800s through the early 1900s, is they had really no insulation and no way of sealing the house. And those houses were allowed to breathe. Modern building science has come up with some new fancy sheathing products, one of which is obviously this thing called Zip Systems. And Zip Systems is made by a company called Huber, and Huber also makes a very durable floor underlayment known as a Vantec. And basically what this stuff is it is an OSB with some pretty high-end adhesives, and this green coloring is actually the weather and air barrier for the OSB itself. From there, what you need to do is either go through and tape all your seams, and you can actually see here where they have the dotted lines. So normally a tape would go over this, which we will eventually do. Or they also make something called a liquid flashing. And the liquid flashing basically comes in a caulk gun, and you caulk it out and then spread it to give you your seal. Here we have the sheathing that we've already replaced, and you can see that it's been taped, but you can also see some little gray spots here on the left hand side, and that is where we've gone through and put the liquid flashing on all the nails. We are using ring shank nails to hold all the siding in place, which is going to be a much stronger solution. And I've also gone ahead and gotten the higher diameter ring shank nails, which are just going to increase the strength exponentially. You can see here on the far right hand side, we've pulled off almost all the siding, and we just have the OSB in place, which is going to come off. And if you're wondering what we're going to do, we're going to be putting on board and batten siding. Board and batten siding is a bit more traditional for Appalachia, as well as the board and batten siding that we're going to be putting on is going to be made from Hemlock. And these are all rough sawn boards. These particular boards for the shed extension that I did, these particular boards came from Pennsylvania, but I have thankfully found an amazing sawyer here in West Virginia, and it's called Helvetia Timber Works. And Dan cuts some amazing lumber, and that lumber we're going to use for our siding. So this for here is a 12-inch wide board and a 3.5 to 4-inch wide batten, and our siding for the house is going to be a 10-inch wide board and a 3-inch wide batten. So it's going to have a very similar look to this, just a little bit more narrow of a gap, and slightly thinner as well. The thing to note is that all this siding is all green lumber, and so basically what happens is as you get this and put it together, you'll get some gaps. So when I built this door, and this is made out of the same wood as the siding, I had closed all these gaps best I could, and because it's rough sawn, you know, they're not perfectly straight, but they're actually really good. And once you seal it up and screw it together, well, it's going to start to dry more, and so you can actually get some spacing that occurs because of that. And this is completely understandable and acceptable. Some of you may wonder what we're going to do with all this old siding, and Margaret and I are taking the time to pull all the nails out, and then we're going to sort all the wood, and it's going to be reused.